Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, where for 33 years we have invited voices of conscience to explore the key issues of our day from an ethical perspective. Learn more about the forum online at westminsterforum.org. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter as well. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister at Westminster Presbyterian Church, located on Nicollet Mall in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and moderator of the forum. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. For 3 decades, Mark McKinnon has been solving complex strategic challenges for causes, companies, and political candidates, including George W. Bush, John McCain, Ann Richards, Charlie Wilson, and Bono, who actually was not a political candidate, I don't believe, but certainly a cause. Mr. McKinnon has helped engineer 5 winning presidential primary and general election campaigns. He's a co-founder of No Labels, a nonprofit organization dedicated to bipartisanship, civil discourse, and problem solving in politics. He has taught at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. He's a regular columnist for the Daily Beast and the Daily Telegraph, and he's currently a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. Perhaps his most noteworthy pursuit was the time he spent in Nashville working as a songwriter with Chris Christopherson, an experience he has described as wildly unsuccessful. Mr. McKinnon has been identified by Broadcasting and Cable magazine as one of a handful of players behind every big decision in Washington, putting a unique, sometimes hidden stamp on the outcome of today's debates. In his presentation today, Stop Fighting, Start Fixing, Making Government Work, by the way, he was selected several months ago, and here we are in this week of all time with that topic. In the ecclesiastical world, we say that's providential. Presentation, Stop Fighting, Start Fixing, Making Government Work, he will offer his perspective on both the challenges and the possible solutions to the political paralysis and gridlock in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Mark McKinnon.
Thank you, Tim. Tim, as you can see, is literally a towering presence, and this is fun for me because I actually get a little stool, and I remember I've had a lot of debate negotiations for presidential debates where we're trying to sneak in a little stool so that I look taller, because I'm actually a little guy, so thanks. I can't tell you how great it is to be here and not be in Washington, D.C. Although I've only been here a short time, it's very clear to me that this is true no labels country in every sense of the word, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as Tim said too, the timing couldn't be better or worse given what's happening in Washington, D.C. And I just grabbed the Wall Street Journal this morning as just one example of many that you're seeing and reading. But here's the headline: U.S. running out of cash more quickly. Treasury now sees crunch by October 17th. No deal to fund government in sight. And one of the paragraphs says, unlike the previous budget battles that have consumed the federal government since 2011, there appear to be no backroom negotiations aimed at crafting a comprehensive deal that might offer a respite or even a small deal to get past the deadlines. And then is quoting Senator Mark Warner, who says, I think we've got this false sense of security. This time, the wolf really could be at the door. So we are in a crisis, and unfortunately, it's been a series of crises, and we've managed somehow to survive until today. But as we look at the road ahead and what's happening today, there's a lot of reason and rationale for deep concerns. And that is one of the primary reasons that we started No Labels. So let me back up just a little bit. I want to just give you a little bit of bio-information on myself. I know you're here not because of me, but because of the topic that we're talking about today. But I just want to give you some context about how I come to this table and this place. As Tim said, I had a wildly unsuccessful musical career. I went to Plan B at a certain point after I realized I was going to be the second act at the St. Paul, Minneapolis Holiday Inn when I was 50 years old. And And I ended up in journalism, and I covered politics, and then I started, somebody I knew ran for an office, and I went to work on their campaign. And then I got involved professionally. I worked for some governors, did a lot of campaigns, ended up in New York with a godfather of our business in media and advertising, and got to work all over the world, working for people running for president here and in other countries, and saw sort of the real power of democracy, particularly in third world situations, and an appreciation for our democracy. Then, through an odd bit of circumstances, I ended up back in Texas, from Colorado originally, but ended up in Texas for music in Austin, Texas. And I worked for Ann Richards, who ran for governor and was governor, a great character. But at that time in Texas, there was really no Republican Party to speak of. It was, you were either a conservative Democrat or a progressive Democrat. And in 1990, I think when she was elected, every single constitutional office, and there was either 18 or I think there's 28 actually when you include Supreme Courts and the courts, they were all Democrat. 8 years later, they were all Republican. So as soon as a Republican Party was established, Texas is a very conservative state. And I had sort of evolved myself politically. I'd always been just either what you'd call left of center or right of center. I became a little more right of center. And then through an odd bit of circumstances, I got to know then Governor George Bush. And he, at the time, was working very closely with a Democratic lieutenant governor who was kind of a Lyndon Johnson type of character. And he wanted us, he connected us, and he was very supportive of his Republican governor. Even though his godson ran against George Bush, he endorsed George Bush over his godson. And so I just tell you that because people don't really remember, unless you were there, what a bipartisan environment there was in Texas in the 90s between the Democratic lieutenant governor and the Republican governor. I went on to work for his presidential campaigns, did all the media and advertising for both those campaigns. I then, for a number of reasons, went to work for John McCain in 2008, but I told him when I went to work for him that, and I wrote a memo to this effect just to make sure. I said, Senator, it's an honor to be working for you and all you've sacrificed for your country. I'm glad to help out, though I have one caveat, which is there's this guy, Barack Obama, who's running for the Democratic nomination, and it appears highly unlikely he's going to win. But if he does, I would be very uncomfortable being your attack dog against Barack Obama. I'll still support you 100%, I'll vote for you, but I think his candidacy would be good for the country, and I would not be comfortable as the person trying to tear him down in his candidacy. And I don't think it'd be good for me, and I don't think it'd be good for the campaign. 6 months later, it happened. He'd forgotten, of course. I brought in the memo and said, Senator, by the way, remember this? And he said, right. And he was very McCain-like and gave me a big hug and said, thanks for helping me get here. It would be very un-McCain-like for you to do anything but walk away, which I did, and it was hard to do. But then given the way the campaign went, I was happy with that decision. But stepping back from all that, having spent a lot more time in Washington than I'd ever planned or intended to, and having watched pretty closely both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, some very similar things happened to both those, as different as they are, both those presidents. And that is, they came to Washington with a real notion and an intent that they were going to change the culture. And it'd be a great story for a reporter to write, to look back at the speeches from George W. Bush in 1999 and Barack Obama in 2007, and if you mixed them up, you wouldn't be able to tell whose was whose speech, because they're so similar in terms of that message about changing the corrosive culture of Washington, D.C. Now, for reasons that are similar and different, they both hit the wall. You know, George Bush had the contested election. A lot of people didn't see him as a legitimate president, caused a lot of problems on his own accord. And we know what happened. And same thing with Barack Obama. You had the birthers who didn't see him as a legitimate president, same sort of thing. So I began to realize that there was something fundamentally broken in Washington, having watched both these presidents. And it's an interesting conversation that we don't really have time for this morning, but we could talk all morning long about why it's like it is. And there's the evolution of the internet, talk radio, the media is complicit in all this, Citizens United ruling on campaign finance, lots of things, and that's an interesting discussion, and maybe we'll get to that in some of the Q&A, but I want to jump ahead to say that anytime that I'd leave Washington, I was struck by the fact that, as I'd go to Colorado or Texas, where I usually am, I had lots of friends and families that were self-described as strong Democrats or strong Republicans, and yet, at the end of the day, they would say, I can't understand what's happening in Washington, because they know that even if we have to disagree, at a certain point you have to cooperate in order to make some progress for the country, particularly at a time when we have the challenges that we do. And that's the way it has historically been. I know we've had tough partisan times in our political history, but we've always been able to, at the end of the day, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, you name it. There was a time in which you say, okay, time to put the swords down, and it's not about who wins or loses, it's about the country and moving forward. And that's where things have become paralyzed. And again, we can talk, and maybe will during the questions, about how that's happened. But I saw, as I traveled around the country, that there was this enormous energy outside of Washington, which was largely frustration and people being incomprehensible in looking at what was happening and saying, how is that possible? Well, it's possible in part because the incentive structures in Washington are all upside down now. And people are getting punished for what I would call adult behavior. And the wrong sort of people are getting rewarded by very vocal minorities that, again, this is kind of going back into constitutional stuff, but because they can raise unlimited amounts of money, often undisclosed, they have an inordinate voice, and an unfair voice, I would argue. So what we wanted to do when we started No Labels a few years ago was capture this energy out in the country to provide a kind of an electronic blanket of support for people who we would describe doing the right things. And right things means meeting with people from across the aisle, having discussions, understanding that cooperation is important in public policy negotiations. And that doesn't exist in Washington until we cranked up this operation called No Labels. But it was this energy that I see in rooms like this, for people who are so hungry to do something about the paralysis in Washington, as we see as the public policy consequences get worse and worse and worse, as we read in the paper every day. So a few years ago, what we did is we launched this thing called No Labels, and we weren't really sure what we were going to do with it at the time. We just knew that we wanted to do something, capture this energy, and somehow apply that force to Congress. And it's been a very interesting evolution, because at first, I'm a kind of a self-described radical centrist, and I thought that there were lots of people in the country who have that same sort of ideological positioning, and I think that's true. And I could argue, for reasons of redistricting and what have you, that Congress is not particularly reflective of the country. And so I thought maybe that's what the organization would represent, and we discovered very quickly, and I did, that you get 100 people in a room and talk about what a progressive or a moderate or centrist is, you're going to get probably 100 different opinions, and that became just a very difficult conversation in terms of getting anything really productive done. And additionally, we realized that the country is polarized, that not just the Congress, but the country's polarized, and that we wanted to, in order to be effective in what we were doing, we had to represent everybody. And then we had a kind of a discussion about, well, let's think about what are some of the systemic problems causing the problems in Congress. And I think there's some very clear systemic problems that relate to how we fund our politics, back to this issue of how people, how they draw districts, primaries, and how they're constructed. So those are things we looked at, and we thought, those are really important, and I personally support all of those things and have other efforts that I'm involved in related to some of those things, but we realized, A, there's other groups doing that, and B, those are very long-term things. Those are 5, 10, 20-year efforts, and we wanted to have more immediate traction. And this is when we kind of found our sweet spot, which is, we said, one of our supporters mentioned to me this morning that the media, and I'll talk about her at the end of the program, but she spent some time in Washington, and the media makes it worse than it is. And to an extent, that's really true, because the media loves the conflict. That feeds the beast. By the way, I'll just tell you a quick example of the media. I was on a media show with somebody that you're very familiar with, a well-known television personality, and I was talking about no labels and what we need to do to bring people together, and we went to a break, and this person said, "McKinnon, could you just cut the bipartisan crap and give us some red meat?" So that's the kind of media culture we have in Washington. We decided that despite that, there were people who really wanted to work together and do the right thing. It's just that they've been conditioned so badly by this upside-down disincentives. So what we wanted to do was find a bunch of issues that weren't really Democratic or Republican, not really left or right. I describe them as more process issues, that we could start getting a conversation, get people in the same room, and kind of start over and build some trust between the different sides of the party. And so we did a lot of heavy lifting on the policy side and looked at things that we thought that people might be able to come together on. And we came up with a lot of really good ideas. And I'm just going to go through a few of them. And again, we can get to more of them later. But things like an up or down vote on presidential appointments. As you may know, hundreds, thousands of jobs in the federal government, including the judiciary and the Treasury, when they're having a meltdown, don't have like half their people in their jobs because of this political infighting. I was appointed to something called the Broadcast Board of Governors, which oversees Voice of America and all our non-military communications overseas. I couldn't get confirmed for 4 years. And it didn't have anything to do with who I was. I was just a Republican George Bush appointee, and so the Democrats didn't want to let me through. And this went back and forth. It was kind of Hatfield and McCoy's fighting. But in the meantime, we didn't have a quorum of that board to meet to address really important stuff that affects our national security and a lot of other things. So that's an example. Filibuster reform. For 50 years, over 50 years until a few years ago, the filibuster was used 35 times in 50 years. So not even once a year. Last year it was used 100 times. Okay, so that's the kind of breakdown that we have, this jamming up government. Question time for the president, just like the British system. A fiscal report to Congress that they have to hear, read, and all sign, so they start with the same information. No pledge but the pledge of the oath of office. Too many of our elected representatives go in handcuffed because they have all these special interests that make them pledge to do one thing or the other. I mean, the most famous one is the Grover Norquist tax pledge, but there are similar kinds of move-on pledges on entitlements. So if all our representatives go handcuffed to Congress and can't make decisions and deal with the environment as it evolves, what are we sending them out there for? And a series of others. Again, I urge you to go to nolabels.org and see these ideas, but the most popular one that truly reflects what the grassroots can do was an idea we came up with called no budget, no pay. And it's as simple as it sounds. We just said, the most important thing that Congress does is writes a budget and appropriations bills, and they're supposed to do that every session, right? And there's a deadline, which is right now. And shockingly, until last spring, and I'll talk about that, but the Senate hadn't passed a budget since the introduction of the iPad until this spring. And the reason that they did was because of no budget, no pay. So here's what the idea was. We said, simply, our broad idea was that if Congress doesn't show up and do their job, which is to write the budget and appropriations bills, and like any business, the budget is a blueprint for what we do. That's how we plan policy. And so we said, if you don't do that, you don't get paid. Create a disincentive. And of course, originally when we mentioned that idea, they were appalled and they said, that's ridiculous. You know, but then not only our grassroots supporters, but this idea suddenly popped out there, and people loved it. They came out of their chairs and said, well, that makes sense. If I don't go to work, I don't get paid. I don't do my job, I don't get paid. And just to give you an example of how powerful it was, so we got a hearing in the Senate. Joe Lieberman held the hearing, but we couldn't get a hearing in the House because the chairman, very powerful chairman of that committee, didn't like it and didn't want it to apply to him or his friends. And so he said, we're not going to hear it. And we said, it's fine to hear it and say it's a bad idea. Just have a hearing, have a public hearing. He refused to do it. And you know how hard it is for an incumbent congressman to lose an election these days? Almost never happens. And this is a powerful committee chairman who raised a ton of money. He got beat because somebody said, I think that's wrong. I think you should have had a hearing on this idea, no budget, no pay, and they ran on that idea and beat him. So, and then this last spring, as you may recall, another in a series of debt ceiling crises, the way that they got a budget bill out of the Senate is they said, okay, we're going to try this no budget, no pay idea. And that's how we got through the last problem, although it was a temporary fix, and it only applied to producing budgets. So the problem is, we wanted to apply to the entire budget and appropriation process. That just applied to producing a budget. And of course, the Senate finally produced a budget, but the House has a budget, and they haven't reconciled the budget, and that's part of the reason that we're where we are today. But there's a great momentum behind making this apply to the overall budget and appropriation process, and if that were the case, I guarantee you we wouldn't have the situation that we're in today. Fast forward, here's the exciting thing for us. So I said this has been organic and evolutionary, but what happens to me is I come to forums like this, and I see people so hungry for this kind of an idea that just say, you know what, we can disagree, but let's get together, talk about it, and work it out. So we realized that in order to make this really work, we had to have members of Congress working and invested in this idea. And we knew that that was a tall order, given all the environmental issues that are going on. But we knew it was important for us to ever be really effective. We had to get them involved and bought in. So this January, we announced the formation of what we call the Problem Solvers Caucus. And we had a big announcement. We got, I think, 20 members of Congress to agree to be part of the caucus. And we said, okay, that's a great start. And quietly, our ambition was to hopefully someday to get to 50 members. Well, I was going to tell you today that it was 84, but then at breakfast I found out it's 86. So we're really excited because what happened is that, and by the way, that's 86, half Democrats, half Republicans. And they agreed to, when they sign up, what happened is that they started having these meetings with their counterparts, and they discovered that the people on the other side were actually some good people, good and decent people with honorable intentions and motives, and that they could work with them, that they could get stuff done if they had bipartisan support. And so they went from meeting monthly to meeting weekly on their own because they found that it's so productive. And in the last 3 months, now you've seen what's happening with the rest of Congress, in the last 3 months they've written 17 different pieces of legislation that they call Make America Work, and that's all moving right now. And they're also moving the whole no budget, no pay idea. So this thing is really kind of hockey sticked in a way. And by the way, when we mentioned to the leadership of the House and Senate, both Republican and Democrat, about this idea initially when we had 20 members, they kind of smiled at us, patted us on the back, and said, come back when you have 50, because they never thought we'd get there. I'm sorry, they said come back when you have 70. So we have now exceeded not only our expectations, but a number that the leadership never thought we'd get to. So they've got to take us seriously now, and they are. And that's the exciting thing, is because when you have a block of that many votes, leadership understands that in order to get something done, and we've got a pocket full of 86 votes, powerful things can happen. So we had a big event a month or two ago where we rolled out all these Congress folks, and I want to tell you that I was really, I met your Senator, Amy Klobuchar, who's a member, and she's terrific. I thought she was just fantastic, complete no-label spirit. We also have Congressman Rick Nolan as part of the organization. And we have a great no-labels local community, and Shelley Stoner is the person I was talking about who gave up a month of her time to actually work at our office in Washington, D.C. But they've done a great job of working this at this level. And so I'm gonna let it end here, except to say, and go to questions. But what I want to say is talk to Shelley, talk to the rest of our local representatives, get involved at nolabels.org. Because I think you have 8 members of your congressional delegation, and that means 7 of them aren't part of No Labels yet, and they should be. So that's something you can do, is go to your members and find out, and just urge them to be part of this, because we're getting traction, we're starting to get some results, and given all the chaos that's happening in Washington, that's critical. Thank you.
You're listening to Mark McKinnon, co-founder of No Labels, speaking at the Westminster Town Hall Forum in downtown Minneapolis.
Thank you, Mark McKinnon. You're listening to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, broadcast live from Westminster Presbyterian Church on Nicollet Mall in downtown Minneapolis. Learn more about the forum online at westminsterforum.org. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter as well. I'm Tim Hart Anderson, Senior Minister at Westminster Presbyterian Church and moderator of the forum. Our speaker today is Mark McKinnon, co-founder of the Washington-based organization No Labels. We'll be taking questions from our speaker from the radio audience through Twitter and Facebook. Our Twitter handle is Westminster THF, and you can find us on Facebook at Westminster Town Hall Forum. While the ushers collect questions from the in-house audience, I want to invite the radio audience to join us here at Westminster for our next forum on Tuesday evening, October 15th at 7 p.m., when national security expert Valerie Plame Wilson will be our guest speaker. And now, Mr. McKinnon, if you would return to the pulpit, I will present the questions from our audience. No Labels strikes me as a populist movement, and other populist movements over the years have tried to make change in Washington. Very few of them have made significant inroads. There's one called the Tea Party. Can you describe the impact of the Tea Party as kind of a populist movement? Is it, in fact, a populist movement?
Well, it certainly captured the energy of an important constituency in America, one that is highly mobilized, highly vocal, and again, it's been very effective over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, not in ways that I, as a progressive Republican, endorse, but it shows the power of capturing that energy, and again, there's a variety of reasons that groups like the Tea Party have been as powerful as they have, because they figured out how to use the tools and the new money in the system to mobilize. And I think it's an example of what you can do in the current environment with the tools that are available, and that's what we're trying to do with No Labels, is employ the same kind of tools, the same kind of power, and the same kind of energy.
If one side in the political process refuses to compromise, and the questioner says, for instance, the GOP, and punishes those who attempt compromise within their own party, how can we make any across-the-aisle progress? Is it futile?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I think that the fact that we have as many grassroots supporters as we do and people mobilizing I feel a tipping point coming on where people are fed up, they've had it. This idea of these interests in Washington simply shoveling sand into the engine of government is bad for the country. What's happened is that people have gone from a place where they may not have liked what was going on in Washington, but they generally became apathetic because they didn't feel like there was anything they can do. Now what's happening is that the consequences of this gridlock are so great that people are mobilizing. The people that are coming to No Labels recognize that they see the consequences down the road, like I just read in the Wall Street Journal, and they know that it could be catastrophic. And so I'm compelled. And by the way, there's a couple of Tea Party members in No Labels, and so our idea is that we get those people into a room and meet with their counterparts and recognize we can condition them to understand and at least have a conversation that we can change behavior and change the outcomes. So that's part of our goal, is to get everybody in the tent and everybody talking, and we think if we get everybody talking, that's a great start, and that's what we're discovering.
Money seems to be a particularly key part of this problem in politics. What are the prospects of overturning Citizens United?
Well, this one is close to my heart. This is part of the reason I initially supported Senator McCain. I feel very strongly about the corrupting influence of money in politics, and I think it just permeates everything. And is at the root of a lot of our problems. I want to just tell you a brief anecdote from Texas. This is kind of a classic Texas story. I worked for another governor before Ann Richards, and when he was elected, in typical fashion, his campaign manager became the appointments person, right? So the campaign manager who raised all the money now becomes the guy who selects the people who get all the jobs in government. Well, in Texas then, and now, unbelievably, you can give as much money as you want to anybody. You can give $10 million to somebody running for governor. So he was having a meeting with, it may have been a counterpart from Minnesota. It was either Minnesota or Wisconsin. And so it was the campaign manager and appointments chief for the governor of Minnesota or Wisconsin, and which had very different laws, or has different laws. And so his counterpart said, yeah, here, you can't give more than $500 or $1,000 to somebody running for governor. And the guy from Texas said, wait a minute. You can't give more than $500 to somebody who's running for governor? And the guy said, yeah. And he stops for a second, shakes his head, and says, well, so how do you know who to appoint? And he was serious. And so, for those of us who are concerned about money in politics, Citizens United is a crushing body blow. My hope was that that decision, and for those of you who may not know, that decision basically said, corporations are people, and it sort of struck down all of McCain's finance reforms. And unfortunately, I think there's about to be another decision from the Supreme Court that makes things even worse, because I think they're going to eliminate any caps on giving. So anybody can give as much money as you want to anybody. It's just astounding to me. I believe in free speech, but I believe in fair speech. And if somebody can give millions of dollars, like some people are doing through PACs now, and I can, compared to somebody else, that seems to me completely unfair. The problem is that until the Supreme Court changes, it's unlikely that anything will change. And so we have to sort of wait till that up. That said, there's a lot of good people doing a lot of hard work on a lot of legislative and regulatory fixes that can happen that have to do with making sure we know how much money's coming in, who's giving it, where it's coming from, full transparency, full disclosure. So there's a number of other remedies that we can work on in the meantime, but it's a very frustrating circumstance right now. And so overturning Citizens United is probably not happening anytime soon, but has to be done. But in the meantime, there are things we can do.
Will our government work better if we push for and get public financing of elections?
Yeah. Well, again, I support the idea of public financing of elections. I think the notion of anything. Well, let me back up. I spoke to the freshman class of Congress that came in this time. Every single one of them, and for that matter, anybody else you talk in Congress, hates raising money. I mean, there's very few people you're going to find that actually like raising money, and the numbers are astonishing in terms of how much time they spend having to raise money. I'd say on average it's probably about 70% of their time that they spend raising money. So that's a problem, right? They're supposed to be working on this debt ceiling crisis, and they're out raising money for their next election. And if they're spending that much time, so I'm for anything that reduces that imperative to raise money. And I think that small donor financing, public financing, there's a number of different mechanisms that create, say, if you raise X amount of money from $100 donors, you get a match for that money at a 4-to-1 match. Just good ideas that mean that the candidates don't have to spend as much money raising time. So I support it, and I think there's some good ideas. And so there's some states out there working on these kind of ideas, and they're doing it successfully.
To what extent do the political polarities evident in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere merely reflect the culture of the U.S. today?
Well, great question. I kind of touched on that earlier, which is to say, I like to think that there's a bunch of people like me ideologically out there in the country who aren't being represented, and I think that's true. But to the questioner's point, this country's become more ideologically separated, and part of the reason for that, well, there's lots of reasons, but we've become such a mobile society that people are clustering now among like-minded people. We used to have to live and go to church and go to school with people who were different than us. But now, because of technology and mobility and a lot of other things, people sort of self-aggregate around people who are like them. And it reinforces behavior. And so I think for those reasons, we have a generally more polarized country. And that's part of the reason that No Labels, it's part of our mission to make sure that we represent as broad a constituency as possible, but because that's the way the country is, unfortunately.
Here's a question from one of our high school students. What are some strategies your organization, No Labels, uses to coerce, I would guess maybe encourage, would be to encourage congressional leaders to join your campaign of cooperation, the bipartisan campaign?
Great question. One of the things that gives me hope and inspiration is the younger generation. The millennials and people who are now just becoming a voting age, people in their 20s, and they're people that I've spent time around the last few years teaching, because you have a real different DNA, which is that you're passionate but skeptical. You recognize that there are huge problems out there that have been dropped in your lap that aren't going to be fixed through the traditional channels. And so what we're seeing is a lot of younger people are not going sort of to work for the local Democratic Party or the local Republican Party or the local member of Congress or whatever it might be. What they're doing is they're going to places like No Labels. You can't believe the number of people we get who want to intern at our office. We had 70 interns this summer, and we have an office that's like about a third the size of this room, and we had 70 interns in there out of 1,500 applicants. But it's that kind of power and enthusiasm that the younger generation who are going to nonprofits, very entrepreneurial directions, but very non-traditional directions, that I think, and advocating for change in new ways, that gives us hope. And so through a lot of their energy and your energy, the reason that we have 86 members is because people were using social media, a lot of younger folks, contacting their local representatives saying, this No Labels thing sure seems like a good idea. Why aren't you part of this? And so when that fired up, that's when we went from 20 to 86. So it's been an integral part of our success.
Speaking of social media, here's a question from Twitter. A questioner wants to know about redistricting. What is the impact on the extreme partisanship in our politics of redistricting, and what can be done about that on the state and national level?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and arguably the primary, one of the primary reasons behind the truly hyper-partisan nature of the districts that are in Congress, because it's become a self-protection racket. And because in most states, you have what's called redistricting every 10 years, where they kind of do a census count and reallocate the congressional districts, and you have a bunch of politicians in a room drawing those lines. And so they draw the lines in a way that protect an incumbent. And if you have an incumbent Republican, what you do is try and get all the Democrats out of that district, draw it in ridiculous ways. So, I just found out, I'd been in Colorado, that my congressman now in Austin, Texas, is from Dallas. And I don't know how well you know Texas, but that's a long way away. So that's a huge problem. Some states like California are experimenting with new ways of doing redistricting, which is they get a non-political panel, and sometimes, I can't remember if this is California specifically, but sometimes they have judicial people involved. So which is not to say it's a perfect solution, but they are looking at ways to depoliticize the process, which is a step in the right direction.
Another question from a high school student. What's one idea you have to place restrictions on the ability of senators to filibuster without a specific reason?
Yeah, well, our idea is that they have to have a reason. And, no, I mean, really, because that's the way it is now. It's like the threat of a filibuster creates this enormous chaos. So the idea is that if you are really going to filibuster, then you've got to actually take the floor and articulate what your filibuster's about. And so that would reduce probably by 80% the filibusters that we have now.
What happened to Occupy Wall Street as a political force in this country?
Yeah. Well, That's a really interesting idea. It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, although I will say that I taught a course at Harvard, and the name of the course was Disruption. And so I examined all the kind of movements in the country, including no labels, that are trying to do things differently and change the political dynamic we're currently experiencing. And I had somebody from Occupy Wall Street come to the class, and he was fascinating. It was really interesting about kind of the way they think about change and power, but it's distributed. There's no real leadership in the movement, and that's part of the reason that the energy is dissipated. But I do think that it was a powerful movement at a critical time that drew a lot of attention to issues, particularly around Wall Street, that I think people generally agree have yet to be addressed. So, and I think that that's likely to be an ongoing issue. So I think Occupy Wall Street gets a lot of credit for that. But the exact status of the organization right now, actually, I really don't know, and I'd like to know.
Another question from Twitter. Do you think there's such a thing as moderate extremism?
Well, that's kind of why I call myself a radical centrist. I think that in order, part of what needs to be communicated, and I speak for myself only now, that there's a notion that people in the broad middle of politics are not passionate, which is not true. And so I think that it's important for people who find themselves in kind of the middle politically to show their passion, to show their enthusiasm, to show their advocacy, and not to sit back because of the partisanship, because of the redistricting. I think that we have lost a voice in American politics that needs to be returned, and part of it means we need to get extreme about it.
What do you do if the best solution to a problem is perceived as not a centrist solution, but rather one leaning toward one end or the other of the spectrum?
Then we go with it. That's the exact purpose of No Labels, is to get in a room and forcefully articulate our ideas. But at the end of the day, we say we got to move on. And if the mood of the room seems to be heading one direction, then that's the way we go. That's what our politics should be about. We get in, we argue forcefully our positions, but if we disagree at the end of the day, we don't just draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going to play. We say, okay, we're moving on, and it's not everything I wanted, but progress is more important. Problem solving is more important than my party.
One of our questioners wants you to go a little bit deeper on the media question, the impact of the media in the U.S. today on our political polarity. In other words, how did you respond to the question, to the person urging you to go for some red meat?
I'm not sure I can say that on the air.
The red meat, yeah.
There's a lot of discussion about the media and bias, and a lot's been written about, is the media left-leaning, is it right-leaning? And that's an interesting discussion, and there's some relevance to that. More importantly, though, the bias that media has is toward conflict. It's not ideological, it's all about conflict. What they want is red meat, just like that celebrity told me when they went to break. They want conflict, they want fire, they want sparks, and it feeds on itself, and it's a very disturbing trend, and I'm not sure what to do about it. I can tell you just another anecdote. Again, I can't name names, but there was a program, and I knew the producer there, and this happened to be a kind of a left-leaning show, and for a while, they would have me and some of my brethren and sistren on to sort of reflect a Republican point of view, although some of my, Rush Limbaugh would say I'm a squish, and not really representative of the party overall. They would at least make some attempt to show the Republican point of view in that program. And then this friend of mine, a producer, called and said, Mark, I hate to tell you this, but I was just in a meeting, and they said, we're not going to have any Republicans on anymore. And I said, well, personally, I don't care if I'm on, but I think it's bad for you. I think it's bad for the show, and I think it's bad for the country that you've made an editorial decision not to show a different point of view. And that's exacerbated by the technology that we have now today, because we're all kind of living in tribes, isolated tribes, and I'm guilty as well. I get up every morning and I have my little kind of internet sites that I go to, and it's kind of leans a certain direction, and it's not like the old days where we just had 3 television entities that had a pretty broad point of view. So people have to really work in order to expand their horizons and not limit the conversations and just deal. And so we're sort of in a world where we live in what I call confirmation bias, which is we live in these kind of bubbles where, thanks to the media, we just get information that reinforces what we already believe.
What's the difference between a progressive Republican and a Democrat?
Well, not a lot, generally. I'd say that a progressive Republican is probably has different views on, I'll just take 2, for example, trade and unions. I think that'd be kind of a separating line, whereas a Republican would be more open about trade, not as restrictive on trade, and have a lot sort of more a different view about unions, particularly public unions.
Is this the time, or will there ever be a time for a viable third-party alternative?
It's a great question. I would yes is my answer. I think that
yes, this is the time, or yes, there will be a time.
I think the great thing about democracy, as messy as it is that I think that there's powerful forces at work that can really turn things on its head. I mean, we elected an African-American president. We never said that would happen. So when the country gets mobilized or passionate about something, it can throw conventional wisdom out the door overnight. It's happened time and time again. So if what we see happening in Washington continues, sure. If somebody's out there and says, I'm not going to be hostage to either party, I'm going to do things differently, I'm going to take a different point of view, and I think that obviously there's huge hurdles to do that, and an organization tried to do that in 2008 unsuccessfully because they just didn't get the right candidate to step up. But I think given the current circumstances, given the environment, absolutely it could happen.
How do you respond to this potential criticism? Does your block of 86 votes violate your principle of no pledges, having those votes in the pocket, as you said?
No, because they're not pledged to do one thing or the other. I mean, they're not pledged to vote one way or the other. All they've done is they've just said we're going to meet and we're going to discuss and we're going to. So we don't know. Well, we have no control over what they do or how they're going to vote. So they're not pledged to any sort of action except to put their labels aside and meet regularly and try and create some problem solving.
Question about candidates who start out in an election season as one person and then kind of morph into an alternative personality as the campaign progresses, and especially following their election. Is that the way it has to be in American politics?
Well, it doesn't have to be, and it's all about accountability. I got an interesting question this morning from some of our supporters about how do we make sure that people who sign up just don't use that as kind of a shield to go home and say, oh, I'm a problem solver, and not behave in a way that's sort of in accordance with our philosophy. And it's something we've talked about. We're not exactly sure what the solution is going to be, except that there's going to be accountability, because we've gotten the kind of numbers now where we're going to say to our leadership, okay, this is fine, but if somebody goes out and behaves in a way that's contrary to our general philosophy, then you got to bounce them out. And so they've got to be accountable to the sort of policies and ideas and behavior that we've outlined in No Labels. So that's one way that we're going to keep people accountable.
This is from a student in the audience. What can students or young people do to problem solve in their own communities?
Well, join No Labels, nolabels.org. The exciting thing for us is to just see how this has taken off. And as frustrated as I've been over the years, this last 6 months, I've been really excited to just see things taking off, and the interest that we have and the people joining and helping us fund this organization has really given me a lot of hope and inspiration that things can change, and they're going to change in this country. So we've been so successful in Washington that now we've had some people step up, some grant. We got some grant money and some other donations, and people say, "This is so good. Let's take it to the states." So starting next year, we're going to really start coming to places like your city and saying we're going to start having problem solvers coalitions in the local legislatures. So look for us next year. I mean, I think you all do pretty well compared to a lot of other states, but I'm sure you could use a little no labels activity at your state legislature as well.
Will the next presidential candidates from either the Republican or Democratic Party be part of the problem-solving caucus?
We would love that. You know, I think what ultimately is going to happen is that, you know, the people who are in the problem solvers are finding it so rewarding, both in terms of productivity and the feedback that they're getting from their constituents, that I think increasingly, if not this election, then the next one, I think it's very likely that the candidates will be members of the problem solvers.
Would it help our system if the election season were a little shorter?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I like the British model, and I think it's the British model, but there's certainly foreign models that I've seen where 60 days, that's the election. You know, all the advertising, all the debates, everything happens within a 60-day window. So yes, I'd love to see it shortened somehow.
Time for one final question. Are you hopeful about American democracy?
I'm really hopeful. I'm inspired by what we've seen. As I said, it's frustrating when you look at Washington, particularly the way the media portrays it, but I'm convinced, having dealt with these 86 people who are now in the Problem Solvers Caucus, that they're good people with good intentions. They just needed a little cover, and the more cover we provide, the better our democracy is going to get.
Thank you, Mark McKinnon.